Unishalma parim sifatenu. Our davening is there to take the place of sacrifices. Now, I think it's hard, again, I think it's hard for us to think about that. I think if you pushed all of us to answer the question of, do you really, want to rebuild the temple and bring sacrifices? I think a lot of us might be hesitant to say yes. But the reality is that sacrifices certainly do loom large in the Torah. They are something that not only, the Rambam himself, who seems to think in the Moreh Nevuchim that they're not so central in his book of Jewish law, he certainly makes them very central. And it's hard to deny sacrifices in Judaism. Again, our prayers really are there in the place of sacrifices. And so if you think about it, if you were a Jew, living, let's say, instead of today, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and you prayed every day that God should bring us back to the land and should rebuild the temple, 3 times a day. And then you lived in a world in which suddenly Jews maybe had the ability to go to Israel. Perhaps you live in 1845, 1850, when all of a sudden there are trains, there's steam trains, there's steamboats. The possibility of, a Jew who lives in Israel or in the East, the Jew who lives in Eastern Europe or a Jew who lives in Sephardic lands going to Israel is not out of the realm. And maybe you've even seen photographs of the old city or of the Temple Mount. And so all of a sudden, in the middle of the 19th century, the idea of going back to Israel becomes a bit more of a reality than it had been. Now, obviously Jews always wanted to go back to Israel, and Jews, the Rambam got back to Israel in, people went there, the Rabbi Yosef Cairo, in the 1500s. It wasn't easy, but somehow we live in a smaller world once you reach the middle of the 19th century. There are, telegraphs, there are Jews who have political power and money in a way that Jews never had before. People like the Rothschilds and others. There are Jews in the British Parliament in the mid-19th century. And so all of a sudden, the possibility of Israel becomes much more of a reality than it ever has been before. And so if you put yourself in the shoes of a Jew living in the middle of the 19th century, and you think about going back to Israel, what do you think about? Right? For us, we don't think about sacrifices. When we think about Israel, we think about, should we buy an apartment in Netanya or in Baca? And, where's the best place to eat? But for a Jew who, lives at a time when there's almost nothing in Israel and has been praying for millennia to go back to Israel and to rebuild the temple, you can imagine that bringing back the sacrifices is a very big deal and is not something outlandish. It's something actually that should occupy a very primary space for Jews. So part of this learning, I think you have to put yourself sometimes in other shoes. This is something I talk about a lot in my daily morning class, is that when as I mentioned before, and anybody's welcome to join that, it's at 8:30 every morning. We've been reading the books of 19th century Orthodox Zionist rabbis. And one thing you have to really do is to figure out how to put yourself in their shoes. It's very different than for Jews like us living today. But the idea of bringing sacrifices certainly existed even after the exile began. You can see it, at least a hint to it, as early as the 6th century. You can see it here. There was a historian who was at the time of Emperor Justinian, and he seems to write in his secret history, as if it were not enough to do away with the laws of the Romans daily, the emperor also exerted himself to destroy the traditions of the Jews. It's good to know that's not something new. For whenever in their calendar Passover came before Christian Easter, he forbade the Jews to celebrate it on their proper day, to make then any sacrifices to God, or to perform any of their customs. Many of them were heavily fined by the magistrates for eating lamb at such times, as if this were against the law of the state. Knowing countless other such acts of Justinian, I cannot include them since the end of the book draws near. In any case, I told you enough to show you the nature of the man. So he doesn't think much of Justinian, but you do see that the Jewish people seem to at least have brought sacrifices And this is, of course, after the exile, not too long after the exile, right? It's only about 400 years after the exile. But this isn't a proof, I don't think, but it's certainly possible that Jews, what is this lamb? So that would seem to be the Korban Pesach. One of the things that we're going to see in the course of the Shir is that the Korban Pesach is an offering that is much more, the possibility of bringing Korban Pesach is much more palatable halachically than perhaps bringing other sacrifices. And as it might be the case that you would conclude for several different reasons that it's not appropriate to bring sacrifices today. But nevertheless, the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, actually dodges a lot of the roadblocks that you might see in other sacrifices. Okay, so I want to look at Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. He was really the first of the what we might call modern Zionists or pre-modern Zionists. The Mizrahi, which comes 50 years later, really bases itself in many ways on Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. For lack of a better term, he was a Haredi. Everybody was a Haredi, although he actually, I think, opened a yeshiva where they were trying to teach other languages. But he was connected to the Chassam Sofer, a very serious Jew, and he wrote a book in 1852 called Drishat Zion. And it's important because he's one of the folks who really wakes up in the middle of the 19th century and says, hey, we can finally go back to Israel. It's possible now in a way that it never was before. Times are really different now. And for him, as he's starting to think about going to Israel, and the idea of Jews going in a very serious way to Israel, one of the first things he thinks about is sacrifices. And he ends up in a very drawn-out dialogue through letters, many, many letters, between him and Rabbi Akiva Eger and others about the nature of bringing sacrifices today. And there's a big argument about it. We'll look at some pieces from the back and forth. So this book contains a few different things. It contains his writings about the importance of going back to Israel. It contains a series of letters back and forth between him and other rabbis about bringing sacrifice. It contains a small book, Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was really one of the great poskim of the time, about the nature of sacrifice. This is just from his introduction to the book, just so you can have a sense of, again, the shoes to put yourself in the 1850s, at least from from a Jew's point of view, a great rabbi who's thinking about going back to Israel and what that entails. He says, Mishkamtia Zot Lano Feres Bnei Hamim. The Jews are supposed to be praiseworthy in the eyes of the nations. He says, we're living at a time of nationalism, right? This is a time when nationalism is coming to the fore. And he says, we too, we're not just a religion, we're also a nation. And we need to think about Nachalat Avotayim. We need to think about our ancestors' inheritance. Eretz HaMekudeshes HaShomema, the holy land which lies barren and fallow, L'sumalav Ketzon Adam, Hamachal Pritiya Utilatam. Lama Anshe Italia Vashar Medina Simasru Nafsham Avor Etzavasem. We see that the Italians and others willing to sacrifice their lives for nationalism, for their own countries. Alachas Kamkar Eretz Kazos. So we have a land, he says. We are Jews. We're not just supposed to live in the Beit Midrash in Europe. Shekol Yoshvei Tebel Kadosh. And everybody tells us, your land is a holy land. Yamro Lavanachnu Nama Mirachok, Gavar Ein Ayil V'Leiv Ayin. And we're supposed to stand back here in Eastern Europe and not lay claim to our land. Everybody else is swept up in the nationalism of the era. We've had so much destruction over time. This has not stopped us from loving our land. He says it doesn't take away from love of the land that we dwell on, now in Eastern Europe. As Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah said to those who were living exiled into Babylonia, you should seek out the peace of the city you're living in. By the way, here in Washington, sometimes I think people, especially because they work for the government, sometimes feel, how am I supposed to be both a loyal American and also a loyal Jew to the land of Israel? Can you have that kind of dual loyalty? People are going to accuse me of that. Am I going to lose my security clearance? When I first came, it was my custom to say the prayer for the state of Israel before the United States, and people were very nervous about that and a little upset and chill. So I switched it around. But you can see that's always been a concern. And he says you don't have to worry about that. You can care about the country you live in and still be loyal and want to go back to the land of Israel. Hello, Caesar Agadol, Nikolai, Shochain, Vilcheshan, Vakonalo Bias, Bekiris, Berlin, Lechavan, Shpavas, Gvira. There's even Nikolai, has houses in different places. So to us, we can buy the land in Israel. Rabbi Kalisher, actually, he wrote to Baron Rothschild. He thought it was very, very important. He realized that the land was pretty empty at this point. I don't know if it was empty as he thought, but he really realized that this was a moment when Jews had political power and they had the money to buy the land of Israel. He was really encouraging it, and that's what he's doing here. He's saying, we can stay here in Eastern Europe if you want, but we need to buy the land. Because then we can bring it back to being the Jewish land. It'd be praiseworthy. This Karolmi Tzidkam Kamash Kasev Shmishi Shlechelik Ba'aretz Chashiv Kechelik Olam Haba. And he's quoting here one of the things that the rabbis write about Israel. The Gemara writes things all over the place about how important Israel is. And that he says, quotes here, the person who buys a piece of land in Israel, it's like a share in the world to come. And the same, this helps to bring the redemption. He was a believer against many others that the redemption will not come in the blink of an eye, but that we have to work to bring the redemption. He felt we have to buy the land, we have to move there, we have to settle it, and then the redemption will come. It's we who have to go first. I mentioned to my morning class that I have a friend who's very wealthy, and he bought a $10 million house in the German colony that he lives in for a month a year. His family lives in, and I said to him, why do that? What is that about for you? He said to me, Zionism. It's about Zionism. And so I don't have the money for that kind of Zionism, but it's interesting. I used to dismiss it. But you do see in certain sources, and you see it here in Rabbi Kalisher, that even if you're not going to live there, buying the land, owning the land does seem to be important. Rabbi Kalisher also quotes from Rabbi Chil of Paris, who lived way before him, right? He's writing in 1852, but it is well known about Rabbi Chil of Paris. So Rabbi Kalisher here is writing about going back to the land, but much of his book, and we'll see some pieces of it, are about bringing back the sacrifices. That for him is a natural progression. To go to the land is not an end in itself. Part of being in the land of Israel, and you can imagine this, again, put yourself in his shoes. If you've been praying about going back to Israel, and that's about rebuilding the temple and having the service, then going back to the land, and this is way at the beginning, before the secular Zionists, he is way at the beginning. He is the first person to say, hey, we can do this. So of course, sacrifice is going to be a natural outcome of that. And then he quotes from Rabbi Chil of Paris, "Sheyesh heter lahakriv ve'ein chashash miyachusei hakahuna." He says you can bring sacrifices. You don't have to worry about who's a Cohen, the clothing of the Cohen. And he says even Rabbi Chaim of Paris, sometimes called Rabbi Chil, sometimes Rabbi Chaim, what's a lahakriv? He wanted to bring sacrifices, and he outlined echdatahu latir rak psachim. Now he says only allowed the Pesach offering. Lo shar korban tzibur. It wasn't going to allow all other Passover sacrifices. Why? There's several issues why the Passover offering is a better idea than other sacrifices. One of them is the shkalim. That korbanot tzibur, that public offerings, for instance, the offerings that are brought in the morning and the evening every day, have to be bought from the half shekel. And if you don't have the half shekel today, because you don't have the Beit HaMikdash, then it's possible, some argue, that you can't bring other sacrifices, but the Passover offering is like a private public offering. It's really a private offering. So it wasn't bought from the shkalim, and therefore it's not sort of holy money, and it's something that an individual brings. So why not bring the Passover offering? Rabbi Kalisher says, listen, I disagree with Rabbi Chil of Paris, who said he can only bring the Korban Pesach. I think you could bring every public offering, he says, and we'll read a little bit more about this later. And he says, I brought other proofs for that. Now, so that you know that it not only were Jews bringing sacrifices, the Passover offering in the 6th century, and that they were suggesting it in the 1200s and in the 1800s, but they are talking very seriously about it today. There are 2 important websites about this to see. One is the Sanhedrin.org. This is Rabbi Adam Steinsaltz's Sanhedrin, committee concerning the Korban Pesach. Another one is korbanpesach.org website. And the Sanhedrin website, I'll put a link. Let me share my document so you have it. Now, if you want to access it later, you're welcome to. I'm going to put it in the chat. And on this korbanpesach.org website, you can actually sign up to be part of the Korban Pesach this year. It says that they will not charge your credit card unless, I'll pull it up for us. It's just good to see. People are quite serious about this. Here it is, talks about attempts in 2007, 2008. Now the problem, every year people attempt to bring the Passover offering, but of course they get up on the Temple Mount and then they usually get arrested. That's usually how it goes. And then that's for the new Sanhedrin, yes. And then this website, you might want to sign up for this. Is korbanpesach.org. And here, anybody wishing to participate in the Korban Pesach can enroll themselves members of the family. The price of 7 shekels, which is the estimated cost of a kazayas of meat. That's, of course, how much meat you have to eat with the Korban Pesach. But it says no money will be collected for undistributed portions. And your check will not be cashed. Your credit card will not be charged until after Pesach. They'll send out the details right before Pesach. In other words, the details are going to be if they're able to bring it. If they're not able to bring it, obviously they're not going to charge your credit card. But you can see that it's not a joke. People are quite serious about it, and on some level, there's a messianic sensibility about it, of course. But the truth is, it's not so messianic. As you see, it's been suggested many times, and it actually makes a lot of sense to. It's much more doable halachically to bring the Korban Pesach. So what are the issues? What stands in the way? So the obvious first one is impurity, that we're all impure. You can't go, you have to go, in order to bring the Korban Pesach is eaten in your own group and has to be eaten in Jerusalem, but the blood has to be sprinkled on the altar. Now, you don't necessarily have to sprinkle it on you could have a very small altar. The altar itself was 32 by 32 amot. And the Rambam says you have to know the exact place of the altar. But Rabbi Kalisher suggests build a very small, minimal size altar, 1 amma by 1 amma, and then you'll definitely be able to put it into the right place on the Temple Mount within where the old altar was. What would you base it on? You would base it on measuring from the wall that we know about. You would base it on if you assume that the rock that's under the dome of the rock is the Even Shasiya, where the Holy of Holies was, then you can use that to calculate where the Mizbeach should be. So you can figure out where to sprinkle the blood and where to build a small altar to sprinkle the blood. What about impurity? So the Mishnah says there are 5 things. Chamisha devarim ba'in betuma and necham betuma. The 5 things you're allowed to bring, even when you're impure, or even when everybody is impure, even though they're not eaten in impurity. Ha'omer shtei lechem lechem apanim zivchei shal mitziber sarasha chadashim. Pesach sheba betuma nechal betuma. Passover offering that is brought in a state of impurity is also eaten in a state of impurity. Shlo ba mitchilaso el la'achila. This is a mission from Sachem, because the point of the Passover offering is not just to bring it, it's to eat it, right? It's one of the only offerings that the whole thing is eaten. Why is the Korban Pesach pushed aside impurity, right? If everybody is impure, as it says, b'moado, in its time. When most of the community is impure. But if you're impure as an individual, what do? You have to bring it on Pesach Sheni, a month later. But if most of the community, if most of the Jewish people are impure, then you're allowed to bring the Korban Pesach on the first Passover. And on some level, it's like everybody is in a state of purity, even though they are impure. Rabbi Nachman said there's an argument here about how this mechanism of permitting, in other words, what happens when most people are tameh, when most people are impure, and we're talking about impurity that's not taken care of by mikvah. In other words, impurity by a dead body, which you need the red heifer for. So if most of the Jewish people are in a state of impurity, which is certainly true today, we hold tuma hutra b'tzibur, that the impurity becomes permitted because everybody is impure. And the question is it hutra? Is it permitted and it's just like it's like everybody's pure, or is it dechuya? It's just pushed aside, and that's a little bit that has its slightly different repercussions. For instance, let's say that some are pure and some are impure in a certain family that's working in the temple that day of Kohanim. Kuli amalo pligi de tahorin. They the Torin Avdi, that they could certainly, those who are pure from the family could do the work, Tmei Lo Avdi, but those who are impure from that family of Kohanim cannot do the service. The question is, what about people from a different priestly family? Could they do it? So Rabbi Nachman Amar Heter Hi B'tzibur, that's Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, it's permitted, Lo Mahadrinan, and you can't use people from another group that are impure. We don't look for other priests, we don't look for other Kohanim. The Kohanim that are impure can do it because it's Hutra, it's permitted. Shesha says, no, it's just pushed aside. And it's better to find those who are in a state of purity. If you hold it's Hutra, it's totally permitted. It's as if impurity doesn't exist anymore, then you could even if you have access to other priests who are pure, you don't have to go and find them. That's a very radical pushing aside of Tuma. And it's usually how we phrase it, Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, that it's permitted, that it's pushed, that it's as if it doesn't exist, the impurity. And some even say that within that group of Kohanim that's supposed to be working there now, even the impure ones could do it. Because any time that most of the Jewish people are impure, the Torah permits us to bring sacrifices, even in a state of impurity. Rashi says, Torah permits, if most people are impure, the Torah just permits it. It says, it says, if a man is impure to a dead body, so then they can't go onto the Temple Mount, they can't bring a sacrifice, and they have to bring Pesach Sheni, they have to bring the second Passover offering. Ish nidche le Pesach Sheni ve'ein tzibor nidchen. That's only if it's ish, if it's one man. But if it's the whole community, then you don't push everybody aside to the second Passover. Rather, they do it all on the first Passover, even though they're in a state of impurity. Okay. So that's, let's look at it in the halacha. The Rambam quotes this halacha. It says, Kate Sandochen is a tuma. How does impurity get pushed aside if most of the community is impure? Time comes to bring a sacrifice, and most of the community is impure to a dead body. Or the community is pure, but the Kohanim who have to do the work are impure. Or if everybody's pure, but the vessels are impure. Then you do it in a state of impurity, and those who are pure and those who are impure, they can all do it. It's as if there is no laws of impurity. And everybody can go even into the Azara of the temple, the courtyard of the temple. But this does not apply to other kinds of impurity that we can take care of through a mikvah. Right? So today we could go to the mikvah And the kind of impurity that we can't get rid of, which is the red heifer, which needs a red heifer, that would be permitted just because most people are impure. Okay. One more halacha in the Rambam. How do we know that impurity to a dead body, if everybody is impure, gets pushed aside? As it says, those who were impure. Same idea from the Gemara that individuals have to bring it on Pesach Sheni, but not if the whole community is impure. Okay, so that's the concept of impurity. So you see that there's lots of grounds for impurity today being considered purity. Now, there are some other things that this depends on. For instance, whether the holiness of the Temple Mount is a holiness that's there forever or not. That has certain repercussions on the way that the sacrifice that we brought is considered, but that's generally the principle. What about the Beit HaMikdash? Do you need a temple in order to bring the Passover offerings? We see in the book of Ezra, this is when Ezra brings the Jewish people back to rebuild the second temple. So it says, Miyom Echad l'chodesh hashvi, on the first day of the seventh month, they began, right, this is Rosh Hashanah, when Ezra brings them back, they begin to bring sacrifices to God. But the temple had not yet been established. So you see clearly that you don't need a temple, at least in the book of Ezra, you see you don't necessarily need the temple building to bring sacrifices. The Gemara says, Amar B'Yeshua, Shemati Shema Krivin Afal Pi She'ein Bayis. I heard that you can bring sacrifices even though there is no temple. Ochlin Kodesh Kadosh Mal Pi She'ein Kloim, that you could eat the holy sacrifices even though you don't have the actual walls of the temple. Kodshim Kalim and Maser Sheni Afal Pi She'ein Choma. Now there are certain kinds of sacrifices you have to eat in Jerusalem, and that is Kodshim Kalim. Maser Sheni have to be eaten in Jerusalem. But what if you're in Jerusalem and there's no wall? The wall has come down. So are you allowed to eat those? So he says, yeah, that's what I heard. Why is that? Why does all this work? If you hold that the original holiness that was created by the Shekhinah, by the divine presence resting on the Temple Mount, that holiness lasts forever, so then it's not the building of the Beit HaMikdash that creates the holiness, it's the space itself of Jerusalem and of the Temple Mount, and they're interconnected, that because the Shekhinah once dwelled there, that is forever holy. If you hold that, then you don't need the temple to create the holiness. Called Rabbi Lezer Sarba Lo Kid Shalasi Lava. Rabbi Lezer argues with this because he holds that the original sanctity of Jerusalem and of the Temple Mount is not forever. Therefore, he might require there to be a temple building, but we hold that the original holiness is there forever. It's why we pretty much don't walk up on the temple. There's actually an argument. The Rambam writes the halacha, therefore we can bring all the sacrifices, even though there's no temple. Right? He paskins like Rabbi Yeshua. You can eat the very holy sacrifices in the whole courtyard of the temple. That's where it would have been. Even though the temple is in a state of destruction. And there's no wall. You can eat the less holy sacrifices in all of Jerusalem that have to be eaten in Jerusalem, even though there is no wall of Jerusalem, even if it's been knocked down. Why? Because the original holiness is there forever. It's not dependent on the walls or the building. Okay, so those are two issues that we've taken care of. Number one, the issue of tuma, of impurity, that it becomes permitted when everybody is impure, or most people are impure, and that because the holiness of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, is there and is there forever, you don't necessarily need the temple building. The third issue, of course, is a Cohen, right? You need a Cohen to sprinkle the blood on the altar, or at least a small altar that's at the place of the altar. So the question is, how do you know who is a Cohen? Is it enough that my father was a Cohen, is that enough to make me a Cohen? As the joke goes. So this is a big question. Can you know for sure whether people today are Kohanim? Rabbi Kalisher has a few things that he brings about this. He argues, for instance, this is part of a very big argument between him and Rabbi Kiva Eger. One of Rabbi Kalisher's arguments is that we let the Kohanim duchen, and when they duchen, when they bless the people, they make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher ger Hashem mitzvah v'tzivanu. Levarech et Amo Yisrael b'Ahava, right? To bless the Jewish people in love, and they use God's name. Now he writes, if we didn't know who a Cohen was, how could you let them use God's name? That would be a bracha levatala. That's one of his proofs. He has many other ones also. There were those who argue with him. But here's a Gemara. In Bodkin lo min hamizbeach l'mala. We do not investigate a Kohen from the altar and above. In other words, if his ancestors included somebody who served in the temple, then we don't investigate to see, to see the generation before that. Lo min haduchen l'mala. And for the Levites, for the Levium, we also don't go back too far. Sanhedrin. Same thing with the Sanhedrin. If your ancestors served in the Sanhedrin, you don't have to check you. And if you have lineage, we don't have to check too much, and you would be allowed to marry a Cohen or others. We assume basically that people have a chazaka, they have a status quo. If we know somebody to be somebody walks in the shul and says, I'm a Jew, so you give them an aliyah. You don't have to check. You have to use your seichel. Sometimes you have to check a little, but we don't have to check more than is needed. We just have to know that they have a tradition from one ancestor, two ancestors. We don't have to go all the way back. In Bodkin min hamizbeach v'lamala, this is Rashi, hitchil livdok b'imos. You just have to check his mother's family, and if you find that the grandfather served on the altar, served as a Kohen, that's enough to establish that this person is a Jew and that he's a Kohen. Rambam writes, Kol kohanim b'zman hazeh b'chazaka heim kohanim. All priests today, all Kohanim today, have a chazaka. They have a status quo. They have a tradition that they are Kohanim. Vein ochlim ella b'kodshei gvul. And they can only eat holy things like truma within the borders of Israel. V'ushatia truma shel divreihem. That is on a rabbinic level. Truma shel Torah v'chala shel Torah ein ochel sol kon michas. But if you have challah or truma that is biblically considered truma or challah, then you would only be able to give that to a Kohen miyuchas. That is a Kohen who has a record of their lineage. Rambam continues, Ezo Kohen miyuchas. Who is a Kohen miyuchas? Who is a Kohen who has an established lineage? Kol she'idolo shnei edim shu Kohen ben ploni haKohen. Anybody that can bring two witnesses to say that they are the son of a Kohen. Uploni ben ploni a Kohen, adish she'eino tzarich bedika, and can trace himself back to somebody who doesn't need to be checked. What does it mean, somebody who doesn't need to be checked? Because we know that he served in the temple. And if he hasn't been checked, he shouldn't serve. And that's how the Rambam understands the Gemara. They only check to the altar. In other words, once you find that he had an ancestor who served on the altar in the temple, that's enough. Now, this is going to pose a very big problem, right? It sounds like nobody's a Kohen unless you can trace them back to serving in the temple. That sounds like it could really stand in the way of bringing a Passover offering. And Rabbi Kalisher tunes into this and understands it in a different way. I want to look first, before we look at Rabbi Kalisher and his argument against this Rambam, one of the commentaries on the Rambam. This is Rabbi Trani from the 16th century. He's a commentary on the Rambam, Kiryat Sefer. He writes, Mina Torah, right? Because we have a problem. It seems like from the Gemara that you don't have to check too far. He had said here that everybody is a Cohen. Everybody that knows themselves to be a Cohen is a Cohen. So how do we put that together with having to trace people all the way back to serving in the temple? He says, Minatorah kol shu muchzak b'vnei Aaron HaKohanim hu kohen l'chol hadvar. In the Torah, anybody who has a chazakah, anybody who has a status quo of being a Kohen is considered a Kohen for everything. The sopklin, the sofrin, ala chazakos, the chazaka midiraisa, kidi alfinan, ibaisam inogea, v'ochel truma v'chala shel Torah. He says the concept of the status quo in halacha, the concept of a chazaka, that works for biblical things, right? In other words, let's say you have a mikvah and you check to the mikvah today and it's kosher. People went to the mikvah and you check it next week and it's unkosher. So we assume that everybody who went in the mikvah, he went to a kosher mikvah. How do I know? Or an Eruv, right? How do I know the Eruv is up? I didn't check it today. I didn't check it this Shabbos. I can still assume it's up. Why? It has a chazakah. Because the last I knew, it was kosher. And therefore it's kosher until I know it's unkosher. Now we do check Eruvin, because sometimes they do come down. And obviously it depends how often they come down. The same is true of a mikvah. But once I know that something is in a certain state, I assume in halacha, even for biblical issues, that it stays in that state. So why isn't so? That should be true fully for a Kohen also. He has a chazakah, right? If he was a Kohen and he knows his father was a Kohen and his father knew his father was a Kohen, then what's there to say? What's there to argue about? That's a status quo. That's a chazakah. Shamish agabim mizbeach on beis hamikdash. And Rabbi Trani says he should therefore be able to serve in the temple. Any lineage papers, you don't need to know that his ancestor served in the temple. All you have to know is that he has a status quo that he's a Kohen. Says that's enough. He says even today, anybody who knows themselves to be a Kohen is considered a Kohen. And that chazaka should work from the Torah and it should work rabbinically. Rabbinically, you might need more checking. He says there was a situation at the time of Ezra where we only considered them to be rabbinically Kohanim. Why was that? Because they had a special problem, because they were married to non-Jews when Ezra brought them back. But if a person has a tradition that they really are Kohanim, and there's nothing ruining that tradition, there's no reisa, there's no chink in that. Now, one of the chinks, by the way, would be the religious status of the family. This actually happens quite often, that a Kohen who knows themselves to be a Kohen all of a sudden meets somebody they want to marry, and that person is, let's say, a convert, or that person is a divorcee. That's forbidden for a Kohen to marry. Once in a while, it will be the case that that Kohen will go to a Beis Din. The Beis Din will say, well, how do you know you're a Kohen? And they go, I'll say, I don't know, a Kohen. My father was a Kohen. And they'll say, how did your father know he was a Kohen? Was your father religious? Your father go to Shul and Duchen? And the guy will say, no, my father was reformed. He wasn't religious, but he thought he was a Kohen. What's your name? My name is Schwartz. Well, Schwartz is not a Kohen name. And your father wasn't religious. That's not such a good, that's a reisa. There's a chink in your chazaka. There's a chink in your status quo that you're trying to rely on. And so I've seen it before, Bate Din, that will sometimes allow folks, depending on how much evidence there is against, not necessarily evidence against them being Kohanim, but not so much evidence that they are Kohanim. There's a problem with the evidence. They'll allow them then sometimes to marry women they would not have otherwise been allowed to marry. But if a person has a good chazaka, if a person has a good status quo and a good tradition that they're a Kohen, even if you can't trace them all the way back to the temple, that's enough, he says, even biblically. And you could rely on them for pidyon b'chor. You could redeem your firstborn from them, which is biblical, perhaps. And in theory, that should work also for the Kohen, for the sprinkling of the blood for the Korban Pesach. That is Rabbi Trani. This is Rabbi Tzvir's Kalisher. He, of course, is bothered by this Rambam also. And he quotes the Rambam. Kol Kohanim, again, this is 1852. Kol Kohanim b'zman hazeh b'chazaka Kohanim bein ochlim el kodesh gvul. Aval truma d'oraisa lo. The Rambam writes that it only seems to work for rabbinic things, this status quo of being a Kohen, but not biblical things. So what are we going to do about the Korban Pesach, about the Passover offering? What is called a Kohen that we really know he's a Kohen? That's if there are two witnesses that not only is a Kohen, but that it goes all the way back to serving in the temple. So he says, what are we going to do? We're certainly going to need that kind of witnessing for the Passover offering. That's certainly biblical. You need a Kohen to sprinkle the blood. So he says, there are a lot of answers to this. We see the Gemara that says, that Gemara which says you don't check more than just knowing that his ancestors served in the temple. The Rabba Magid, that's one of the commentaries on the Rambam, writes, who are baimos, that actually the main thing the Mishnah is talking about there is you check 4 mothers, 4 generations. Shein Chet, which is 8, Uparach Nivdok Bigvarei, Umashani Le, Umuchach Mishum, She'ilu Haya Ish, Shetzarch Pedika Haya Matzvichim Lo Arba Moses Hulo. If somebody needs checking, you check for their 4 mothers. Avalo Bedika Ad Cohen Jeshimush, but you don't check all the way back to whether they had an ancestor who served in the temple. You check 4 generations. Cohen Shenivdak Arba Imos, the Hainu Ba'arba Doros, any Cohen that you checked 4 generations. Areo Bechaz Kasa, that's a chazaka. L'chein hu lehedja, b'tosfos sham. The question might be, why don't you need 3 generations? Right, 3 is usually a chazaka. Beinatam Kasa b'sefer Yasher dat tzarich b'dika. So what is this whole idea of checking that they had an ancestor who was in the temple? That's davka lahachshir b'neiam la'avoda. That's only if you want to permit their children to do service in the temple. Or himself. But to eat truma, you don't need to check. As it says in Paraklisha, Ani Cohen, V'chever Cohen, Nemar Lechil truma v'inami l'asir isha. Hari desfir l'hu d'lachshir l'avodas atzma, nami mahani b'dika zushal b'alimos, Mari Arisham. Ashas nakat rak l'kula, ein bodkin m'mizbech l'ma'ala. So he says, this is the way Rabbi Kalisher understands this concept in the Gemara, that it sounds like you need to check all the way to see if they served in the temple. He says, no, it doesn't work l'chumra. It doesn't work in a strict way. It works actually in a lenient way, that if you know he had one ancestor who served in the temple, then you don't have to check anymore. You don't have to check his last 4 generations. But the Rambam uses it as a chumrah, as a stricture. But he says that's not really how to understand it. And near the one is Rambam Rabbeinu Tam. Why does the Rambam see it as a stricture? He paskins like Rabbeinu Tam, who understands it that you have to check all the way back to the temple. But many, he says, read it as a kula, as a leniency, that if you can check back, if you know of one ancestor who's served in the temple, you don't have to check anything else. If you don't know of that, then you just check 4 generations, and that's enough. And he says that's not so hard to find. That we could find today. We could find a Kohen here. Kohen is miuchas at least for 4 generations, and that should be enough. And he quotes different. Now you can see why this might be the sort of subject of argument. Okay. An interesting question that I saw in the Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer is a much more recent posek, and he asked the question of, could we use DNA evidence to decide who's a Kohen? Is that eligible? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? So he actually writes that with regard to DNA, he's writing to Professor Dr. Abraham Sofer, and he writes this in the year Tafshin Nun Zayin, which is 2007. There's been a gale of Kohanis Manenu, Kohanim today, Shnechla Poskim, him Kohanis Safek, or Kohanim Vadai. The rabbis, the poskim, disagree whether Kohanim today are definite Kohanim or possible Kohanim. Kfi shem muchzakim. Im yochel adav lishtanas b'hem lefi hamechaker chadash. Could you change their status either from considering themselves a Cohen to saying they're not a Cohen, or the opposite, using DNA evidence? Aydei genetikayim b'bdikasam amadait, checking their genetics with modern science. Hine kedati az kfi shemuva b'sifra b'nishmas Abraham kein dati ata. He says, as they quoted me in the book Nishmas Abraham, it's a modern book on halacha and medicine. Shein lismach lachad zatos v'dik. He says, I don't think we should rely on DNA evidence. Shaklut tzar from the sniffle dramachem. He says, but what you can do is, if you have, like, let's say a chazaka, this person's a Cohen, but not enough of a chazaka, let's say only of 2 generations. So then you could combine that together with DNA evidence, but DNA evidence alone cannot prove somebody's a Cohen. Okay. I just thought that was interesting. This is a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer about this concept in general, with regard to bringing sacrifices. And then we'll look at one more piece from Rabbi Kalsher. I'll wrap it up. We'll take some questions. By the way, if anybody has, I'll finish this and I'll take questions. So this is a very famous tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, where he just sort of writes very quickly the whole concept of sacrifices. And he seems actually to be pro. He says, this is so interesting the way this came up. He says, he's writing this in, how can we rely on a Kohen's testimony? Aren't they biased? No, I don't think we're relying on the Kohen's testimony. I think we're relying on other people's testimony, not the person themselves, but that people know that their father, their grandfather was Kohen. So here, the Chassam Sofer writes to his, this is in 1839, he's writing to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who is his father. Akiva Eiger was the great rabbi of that generation. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalish was a student of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So he greets him with this long greeting, calls him very flowery things, and he says he is the Av Bezdin of Posen, which is what he was. Yakirat Kedusha Yani, that which Mori Chami, that which my great father-in-law said, that he wanted me levakesh misarei Yerushalayim. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva Eiger asked the Chassam Sofer in the 1830s to go to the Muslim head of Jerusalem. I guess whoever was in charge of Jerusalem for the Sultan, Litain, the Ottoman Empire, Litain Rishus Lahakriv. They wanted to get permission to bring sacrifices on the Temple Mount, to bring the Passover offering on the Temple Mount. That was Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Now it's interesting because Rabbi Akiva Eiger actually is opposed to this in some ways, at least in his book, in his writings, Rabbi Kalsher, he seems opposed to it for certain reasons, about the shekel, maybe about the Cohen. But here apparently he did ask the Chassam Sofer to check if it was practical. So the Chassam Sofer writes back, he says, no, the Sultan's man in Jerusalem who kapton gadol, he's a kapton, he's very tough. Kiyahu Omar Labal Yakriv Sham. He says you can't bring a sacrifice on the Temple Mount. Misha Munas Ishmael. You have to be a Muslim to bring a sacrifice on the Temple Mount. Sham Nivne Beis Avoda, and they've built there a Beis Avoda, a mosque. Shalahem. They built their kind of house of worship. Va'omrim, and people are saying she'evan shesiya be'emtza, that the rock from the Kodesh HaKadosh, from the Holy of Holies, the Evan Shesiya, is in the middle of this kippah, of this dome. Below you, Ishazar, and they won't let any non-Muslim go there. And that which you asked me to check on this, so he says, on a practical level, we're never going to be able to do. We're not going to be able to do it right now because the Muslims are not going to let us up there to bring the sacrifice. Apparently, that was a big surprise There's another place where he writes that he saw a picture of the kippah. He saw a picture of the dome over on the Temple Mount. And you can imagine that in 1839, there's like, how many photos could there be, right? Photography is just invented, probably the early form of photography. So people for the first time are seeing that there's the Dome of the Rock. I mean, for us, it's ubiquitous, but for them, they're like, hey, there's something on the Temple Mount. What's going on here? Well, it was built very early. I mean, right? It was built in, I think, in the 800s, right? So I don't know if it was gold or not, but it was built a long time ago. Manasa Metuma. So he says, besides the practical question, what about Tuma? What about the fact that we're all impure? V'yichse kahuna, and we don't know, what about the lineage of Kohanim? V'avnei choshen, and he says, by the way, what about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol? This is going to be another big issue. What about the choshen, the breastplate? We need the stones. Yini b'sefer Kafter b'Perach. There's a famous tshuva in the Kafter b'Perach that says, that Rav Chaim mi Paris alali Yisrael b'shnas Yud Zayin Elef Hashishi, as we mentioned before, that Rav Chaim of Paris went to Jerusalem in 5,000, the year Jewish year 5017. And he said there to whoever was in charge of the Temple Mount, he wants to bring sacrifices. But he didn't really ask about in his halachic work there about impurity and this Cohen issue. Shuv Kasav Dahalo Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. And he writes there that, we don't have to think too much about it because impurity is permitted when it's everybody. We Kohen Miuchas Lo Hiskir Klal Tiritz. And he didn't really give an answer about the Kohen Miuchas question, about who's a Kohen. And the Yavitz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, Every man of a kitzer because of a love Sheesh Lishol Gamal Shiklet Tzibur. Rabbi Yaakov Emden says there's another issue, which is the shkalim that I mentioned before, that maybe you need shkalim to pay for the tamid, for paying for the offering that's brought every day. Ulai Korban Pesach, what's the lakrit? So what did Rabbi Chaim of Paris want to bring? Maybe he wanted to bring the Passover offering, the Baba Tuma. That number one, that could be brought in a state of impurity if everybody's impure. And it doesn't need the half shekel to buy it. And you don't need the clothing of the Kohen. And you don't need a Kohen Gadol anyway. You can use a regular Kohen to sprinkle the blood. No, to do it instead of the Kohen Gadol. So he very quickly sort of answers the questions and says, it's true that other sacrifices you probably can't bring, but the Korban Pesach you probably could bring. That was his opinion. Kiva Eger did not necessarily agree. It's a little bit of the back and forth here between Kiva Eger and Rabbi Kalisher. But maybe we will stop the questions. Let's see if there's one quote I'll take out here. So a little bit about the clothing of the Kohen. And it talks about his back and forth with Rabbi Kiva Eger. And he reports what Rabbi Kiva Eger says, and Rabbi Kiva Eger disagrees with him. Eger here quotes the story about the Sultan. But if any sacrifice is possible, everybody agrees that the one that is most possible would be the Passover offering. And okay, let me stop here and take any questions that people have. If you'd like to, if you're convinced, then you want to sign up for the Passover offering, I gave you the link, I think. So do that. By the way, also one interesting thing to see is the Shomronim, the Samaritans, bring a Passover offering. The picture in the on the Facebook event was the Samaritans. Samaritans bring a Passover offering on Mount Gerizim every Pesach Sheni. And you can go and you can watch that. Also mentioned there's a YouTube video of a Passover offering in Tel Aviv that a congregant of mine once sent me, and he said, oh, I didn't realize they're bringing the Passover offering. I look at the video, and on the bottom it says Targil. It was an example. Somebody had put together people dressed as Kohanim, and they slaughtered a lamb, and they wanted to show how the Passover offering is done. There's definitely a sense. There is some sense in Israel today of kind of fervor to bring back the Passover offering, although for lots of political and practical reasons, it's obviously not really happening. Anybody has any questions? I don't know if anybody's there. Can't see anybody except Sarah. She's downstairs.
Want to?
What?
Should we want to in the end?
Should we want to bring a Passover offering? Is that the question?
Yes.
Good question. What do you think? What do folks think? I mean, we sure seem like we want to when we do the Seder. Trying to remember it, lifting up the plate.
I personally don't
Should
want
pray
to.
about it every day. Yeah, well, that's the thing about being modern folk, right? Is it disingenuous? Well, let me put it this way, right? Assuming that we probably don't want to, many of us, is it disingenuous to pray about it every day? You know, in it we say, God, bring us back, give us back the offerings. Is that a lie?
Maybe it means something other kind of offering.
Oh, so that's probably what we do, right? We probably make internal, we probably fall back on the Rambam, the great modernist.
Or
we think, okay, it's metaphor.
You have Cook's vegetable karbanos.
Oh, okay. There is one place where Cook does say that we're not going to, the time of the Messiah, animals will be sentient beings and will bring grain. God should return back the grain offering of Jerusalem. Okay, yeah, there's that. There's the Rambam. But the Pshat seems to be, look, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah certainly talks about bringing them. It's hard to get away from the Pshat. And I don't know, would it be so bad? I mean, out of all the offerings, the Passover offering is pretty good. It's like, it's very, it's all eaten, it doesn't get wasted. It's done in groups. I mean, we're basically doing that now. We just, buy it in pieces instead, right? You're probably going to have brisket, no? I mean, it wouldn't be that different.
But at the
Lamb
time,
versus beef.
What? Beef.
yeah,
Lamb versus
Lamb is not bad. Lamb's okay. It's amazing that they could roast it. I mean, you see in the Gemara, people just did daf yomi that, like, they had to roast it in like a few hours if it was going to be, if it was like this year that Pesach started Saturday night. It seems, I don't know how people did it. I don't know how it got done that fast. Like, you would think it would take a whole day to roast a lamb like that. I don't know. But we don't have yards in Washington to be an issue. You have to eat it in Jerusalem. So that's an interesting question. I think we have to really ask ourselves seriously. What does it mean? I mean, it's so funny when you read these authors from the 19th century, you realize what a different world we live in. And they could not have imagined Israel today and how easy it would be to get their way. That's a normal society, and right, for us, we go to Israel. Like, for them, they go to Israel, and they're like, of course they're going to bring sacrifices. And you have some of them that went in the 1850s, 60s. But, for us, it's like, just doesn't, even in Israel, it doesn't seem to make, it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to fit for us. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, part of me, I think, believes that, it's no coincidence that we wouldn't relate to it and we don't have it. And that's why we don't have it, because we wouldn't relate to it. And that's sort of God's hand in history. And there's another part of me that thinks, well, maybe there's something we just don't get. I mean, Jews have been thinking a long time about bringing sacrifices. And the 1850s was pretty clear. That wasn't that long ago. I don't know.
It is
and in Israel
interesting
today,
to me that, though, it is interesting to me that essentially there was a clear recognition, even then, shall we say, of the sovereignty of the Waqf over the Temple Mount. There was no question that if that's what the Muslims wanted, that's what the Muslims were getting.
Right. It has to be practical. Although Rabbi Kalisher does bring up, he says, you need to really, he says, if we can bring it, we have a biblical obligation to bring it. So don't think that, we're just off the hook because it's hard to do. But of course, if you can't. Yeah, it is interesting that even back then, and they seem sort of surprised by it. they're surprised. They don't, I mean, they're but I don't know. I mean, maybe yeah, it'd be interesting to go and watch the Samaritans and see if that normalizes it for us more. I don't know if it would. And I have friends who've gone and watched. I haven't done it. But there's definitely a movement in Israel to, I mean, look, there's the making of the, big day kahuna, of the clothing of the Cohen. There's the making of the menorah. I mean, there's definitely a fervor in Israel that's not tiny about bringing back the services. And maybe if one, I don't know, Temple Institute, yeah. Something we should think about. But certainly, out of all the offerings, I think probably Passover offering might appeal to us if we're not vegetarians, because of the communal sense of it, and it doesn't get, it doesn't just get burned on the altar. And well, that's it. I remember I once read something by one of the leaders of the Reform movement. There's the Reform Chumash. He was the editor of it for the early Reform. What's his name? Very famous reformer in America. And he writes about the sacrifices. Obviously, he didn't, believe in the sacrifices, but he says, we eat and we just eat. He says, think about if whenever you were going to eat meat, it had to be sacrificial, or even just when you were going to eat meat, it was going to be sacrificial. What kind of experience would that be? That would be a very powerful experience, right? Just killing an animal and eating it. We do that, and imagine that imagine that part of doing that was bring some of that on the altar to God. I mean, that might really transform the experience of eating, and it might change our relationship to animals. So I don't know if there's, I mean, we consign all of animal sacrifice to something very primitive, but if you're not a vegetarian on this call, then I don't know if we have such an excuse to do that. It's certainly no less primitive than eating meat. And maybe maybe bring sacrifices as much. Jacob, I don't think it was Jacob Milgram. No, it was, who was the famous reformer? The Reform Chumash he edited.
Gunther Platt.
Gunther Platt, that's who it was. It was Gunther Platt.
By the way, I noticed that Chaim Shem left because he's a vegetarian. So just to say.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, I see. He's probably very offended. No, I'm just kidding.
If you're a vegetarian, I understand that you don't want to bring the pet. That makes sense. But if you're not a vegetarian, not much excuse for not bringing the Pesach home. So you can sign up online. All right. Well, we should be returned to our land, a land of peace, speedily in our day, and next year in Jerusalem. Chag Sameach.
Xag Sameach.